Hello YouTube. Today we're going to talk about environmental restoration, particularly with reference to the paper Faking Nature by Robert Elliot, which is really one of the most famous papers in environmental philosophy. So suppose a company proposes a mining project on an especially striking area of forest. Large areas of forest will be cleared and the land destroyed. Not surprisingly, this project is met with a great deal of resistance from environmentalists who charge that the short-term economic benefits don't justify the destruction of such a valuable area. However, the company promises that once the mining project has been completed, they'll consult various biologists, ecologists, landscape architects, and so on, and they'll work to restore the area. The soil will be replaced, the trees replanted, species reintroduced, rivers will be recreated, and all of this will be designed with the sort of irregularity and randomness that you're often confronted with in natural landscapes. So even to a trained eye, the forest will look just as it would as if humans had never interfered with it. The values that are destroyed by the mining project will be fully restored, so it's unreasonable for environmentalists to continue to resist the project. Now, this argument rests on a principle that Eliot calls the restoration thesis, which says that the destruction of what has value is compensated for by the later creation or recreation of something with equal value. The point is that although the mining will be environmentally damaging, we can compensate for that damage by rebuilding the area afterwards. So this argument, this restoration argument, it doesn't address some concerns we might have about the project. For instance, animal rights objections, which appeal to the sort of rights of individual animals whose habitats are destroyed. If you're stripping away the forests, we might wonder, well, what about the suffering caused to the birds, for instance, that live there? I mean, if animals have rights in a similar way that we do, this is going to be a problem, and obviously rebuilding the area afterwards won't fix that. I mean, your right to your property, if that's violated by some mining project, then merely rebuilding it 10 years down the road isn't going to address that concern. So maybe animal rights objections aren't addressed by the restoration argument, but this argument does hope to assuage the environmentalist concern, the concern about the value of the forest, the value of the species and so on, and the rivers and all that. So the basic objection to this kind of argument is that restoration projects are very rarely successful. Indeed, companies rarely follow up on promises to restore the area to the best of their ability. Very often restoration projects are sort of half-hearted, they fail to secure enough funding, and the restored area that results is obviously impoverished relative to its original condition. And I mean, actually part of that is just technological limitations, right? I mean, ecosystems are extraordinarily complex in ways that we don't really even know. We just can't know all of the interactions that go on in them, so of course we can't recreate them. And so very often restoration projects simply don't work. They don't rebuild the area. But of course there's no reason in principle why restoration projects shouldn't be carried out successfully. So if, in the example that we've just imagined, if we could know without any question that the restoration would be successful, would environmentalists have any grounds for continuing to resist the mining company's proposal? Now, Elliot argues that they would. So Elliot rejects the restoration thesis. He argues that there's an important kind of value that can't be restored. It cannot even in principle be restored. So contrary to this restoration thesis, Elliot suggests that, and I quote, an area is valuable partly because it is a natural area, one that has not been modified by human hand, one that is undeveloped, unspoiled, or even unsullied. So part of the reason that we value wilderness areas is because they're untouched. They've developed entirely on their own terms without human interference. We value wilderness areas not simply for their intrinsic properties, but also because they have a special kind of history, a special kind of origin. So it's not just the sort of surface features that matter. It's their history. So this is a value that cannot possibly be realised by a human artifact, by human creation. And obviously a restored landscape is ultimately a human artifact. It may resemble nature, but if you have stripped away a forest, stripped away the land, and then you rebuild it, well, what you've rebuilt is a human artifact. Even if it resembles nature very much, it's ultimately something that's been built by humans, and it's obviously just logically impossible for something that has been built by humans to have this value of naturalness, this value that it has, the fact that it has been unmodified by human hand. Something that's been built by humans can't have been unmodified by human hands. So Eliot thinks we can make this argument more precise by appealing to a notion from aesthetics of art forgery. He says that the restoration thesis asks that we accept a fake or a forgery of nature as a substitute for the real thing. Eliot takes it as uncontroversial that forged artworks are less aesthetically valuable than the originals that they copy, no matter how much alike they are. So similarly, a forged nature, as it were, is less valuable than the original, even if the restoration is perfect. So we've got an argument kind of along these lines. Original artworks have an aesthetic value that forgeries lack, even if the original and the forgery are identical. Restored environments are analogous in relevant respects to forged artworks. And finally, original environments have a value that restored environments lack, even if they're identical. So I think that's sort of Eliot's basic argument in its broad outlines. Okay, so Eliot then considers various objections. First, the argument will rest on an unworkable distinction between the natural and the unnatural. Now, actually, I'm not sure that it would need to appeal to this distinction. Obviously, I mean, this argument, as I've given it here, in its sort of bare bones form, that argument doesn't appeal to any distinction between natural and unnatural things. So I'm not. I think it would be possible to run an argument based on an analogy between forgeries and restored environments without appealing to a distinction between the natural and the unnatural. With that said, it does seem to be true that many environmentalists use this notion of natural value, and that is the approach that Eliot takes, as we saw. So Eliot thinks, however, that the distinction between the natural and the unnatural is perfectly reasonable. People obviously do object to this distinction, and it is sometimes a bit tricky. It throws up all sorts of problems. You find it in arguments like, homosexuality is unnatural, therefore it's bad. I mean, it's not clear what people are talking about there. But Eliot thinks that actually we can define it, and he defines natural to mean unmodified by human activity. And he accepts that this is a spectrum. It's not a strict line. Some areas are more or less natural. Some areas are more or less modified by human activity than others. And Eliot says people value nature not just for its beauty, but because it has developed independently of human interference. The value of nature lies in the fact that it's untouched. I think this is kind of reasonable. I tend to agree with Eliot that the natural-unnatural distinction, as he's defined it, does make sense, even if there are vague cases. But I think there are still some worries here. So, first of all, how in practice do we quantify the degree of modification by human activity? No areas in the modern world are free of human interference. Nowhere on the surface of the planet is free of the impacts of climate change, for instance. Climate change is global. It has an impact everywhere. And furthermore, almost all areas on the planet have been altered by humans in the past. Many apparently natural areas look how they do today due to extensive human modification in the past. A very good example of this is Dartmoor. Dartmoor, look it up if you don't know it. It's a very sort of barren and haunting moorland in England, and it's often promoted as one of England's few remaining wilderness areas. But Dartmoor, like everywhere else in England, it used to be completely covered with forest, just carpeted with forest. Today it's a barren moorland, and it looks like that today because of the activity of prehistoric farmers. Their farming methods led to severe soil acidification and the development of extensive peat bogs. And that, to this day, that defines Dartmoor's ecology. So in a sense then, Dartmoor is actually a testament to the power of human transformation of nature. You could say that Dartmoor is really one of the least natural places in the world. Similarly, even the most apparently unnatural place will develop, could develop largely independently of humans. So think about building a city. Once the city is actually built, large parts of it will be substantially left alone. Consider sewers, for instance. People will enter sewers in order to repair them, but by and large, the sewer will probably have less human activity in it than the local forest. And sewers develop their own ecosystems. All sorts of bacteria and fungi, even some animals like rats, will proliferate in the sewer. So if natural refers to places free of human interference, it's at least plausible that a sewer is more natural than Dartmoor. But the point is, it's very difficult to specify what counts as human interference. So there are demarcation problems with figuring out what places are natural, given Eliot's definition. A second worry we might have, along with these factual problems, is there are various moral problems with the notion of sort of untouched landscapes. So J. Baird Callicott discusses a number of these in some of his work. Here's a couple. First of all, Callicott notes that the concept of untouched wilderness erases a history of genocide and imperialism. So, for example, Europeans did not discover the Americas as sort of virgin lands free of people. When Europeans discovered America, they were heavily populated. The Americas were heavily populated by peoples who had already significantly transformed their environments. These peoples were murdered, raped, enslaved by European invaders. There's a wonderful book by, well, I say wonderful, it's a deeply disturbing book, but it's a very powerful book by David Stannard called American Holocaust. I really recommend it. It's about the genocide of Native Americans, and it sort of deals with the extent and development of Native American society, and then what happened when the Europeans invaded. It's very moving, very powerful. But of course, this notion of wilderness, according to Callicott, just erases that whole history. It leads us to think that these places in America are unmodified by human activity. In fact, they have been modified by people who were then exterminated. Second, the wilderness concept is today used as a tool for the continued oppression of indigenous peoples. Callicott cites a number of examples of indigenous peoples who have been forcefully evicted from land on which they've lived for centuries in order to create wilderness areas in line with this ideal of no human interference. Because we idealise the wilderness as a place where there is no human activity, people who've lived in various places for centuries have just been kicked out in order to create these like national parks and proper wilderness areas. So I mean, it's at least questionable whether Eliot is really on the right track in emphasising the importance of completely untouched natural landscapes. There are factual difficulties with spelling out what counts as what counts as an untouched landscape, and there are moral difficulties with the very idea of going down this road. Okay, so the second problem is that if the original area and the restored area are exactly alike, they must have the same value. The objection is that if these two areas are basically exactly alike, then there can be no grounds for assigning different value to them. The only grounds there could be for assigning a difference in value is if there was some difference in the two areas, some relevant difference. Now Eliot responds that this simply begs the question. The claim for which the environmentalist is arguing is that the value of an area isn't determined merely by its intrinsic properties, but also by its history. And Eliot gives a number of other examples to motivate this kind of view. So suppose I'm promised a Vermeer painting for my birthday. When the day arrives, however, I'm not given a genuine Vermeer, but an exact replica of a Vermeer that was once destroyed. So because of this painting's history, because it wasn't painted by Vermeer, I value it less than I would do otherwise. I value it less than I would do if it was painted by him. Or suppose that I'm given a particularly beautiful and elegant sculpture. It's really sort of, maybe kind of fragile. It's this sort of beautiful white substance. It's kind of solid sort of sculpture, quite small, delicate. It's one of my prized possessions until I discovered that it was actually made from the bone of a person who was murdered to create it. So because of the sculpture's history, I value it less. And I think that Eliot is probably right, that people do value or disvalue things for their history. In fact, this is actually quite common. I don't think we really need to appeal to these sort of arcane examples to make this point. So imagine that on his deathbed, my grandfather gives me a watch. Well, if this watch is then destroyed, it wouldn't be compensated for by giving me an exactly identical watch. The history matters. Okay, I value this watch because this is the one that was given to me by my grandfather. This is perfectly normal, I think. So I think Eliot is right that just because two things are exactly alike, that doesn't mean that we will value them the same. There's nothing irrational about valuing them differently. So a third possible objection is that by placing boundaries around certain areas, by designing certain areas to be wilderness areas deserving of protection, we transform these areas into artifacts. We remove their naturalness. So the point here is that preservation of wilderness can only be achieved by active, deliberate policies. We have to place boundaries around certain areas. We have to maybe we have to prevent overgrazing by animals, or we have to certainly have to keep a watch out for illegal uses of land. We might have to build fences around them. We have to actively prevent people from using them improperly. But given this, it seems that the wilderness area has in some sense been positively created by humans. It's not simply that the land has been left alone. We've actively worked to preserve it in a certain state. So this is a fairly common argument, and it's always struck me as quite silly. So as Eliot says, what is significant about wilderness is its causal continuity with the past. There is a distinction between the naturalness of the wilderness itself and the means used to maintain and protect it. That was a quote from Eliot. And I agree. I think there's a very obvious difference between simply preventing people from spoiling a landscape and actively transforming a landscape, for instance, through farming or building houses or roads or whatever. I mean, I think this argument, it's rather like saying that there's no such thing as social and political freedom. There's no such thing as freedom from government interference, because even if you're living under a very libertarian government, that legalises prostitution and drugs and guns and so on, that government has to actively choose not to interfere. And by choosing not to interfere, this influences and this helps to determine the shape of society, just as much as if the government were to act like a bunch of Stalinists. And I suppose, in a sense, that's obviously correct, right? The government has a choice between being very libertarian, or being Stalinist, or being somewhere in the middle, right? And choosing to make your government very libertarian will influence society just as much as if you chose it to be Stalinist. But I still know which government I'd rather live under, right? There's still a distinction there. There's still such a thing as freedom. I think this argument is a bit sophistical. I don't buy it. Okay, a fourth objection is that the analogy between forgery and restored nature fails. An important feature of our reactions to artworks is that we judge them as artifacts. We judge them as things designed for particular reasons. So when we judge the aesthetic value of an artwork, we consider the goals and intentions of its creator. And this, according to this objection, this is what accounts for the relative disvalue of forgeries. So obviously here the assumption is that the goals and intentions of the original artist will be in some sense more important, in some sense more valuable than the goals and intentions of the forger. And that seems reasonably plausible in most cases, right? So most forgeries are made simply to deceive. They're made simply for profit. The original Guernica was making some important statement about the horrors of war. The forged Guernica was made to help fraudsters earn a nice sum of money. I don't know if Guernica has ever actually been forged, but you get the idea. Obviously, we can't appeal to goals and intentions in nature. Nature has no author. So there are no grounds for valuing the original landscape over the restored one. I suppose people who believe in God could object to this. They would presumably say that nature has been created. Although actually, I mean, even if you believe in God, I assume that most people who believe in God would grant that a lot of what goes on in the natural world sort of happens of its own accord, as it were. I mean, most people, I think, don't assume that God is sort of directing the growth of every single little plant, every single blade of grass. Although there are, I suppose, some people who would say that. But I'll put that to one side. Anyway, Eliot responds to this argument that our judgments can be informed by knowledge of many kinds, right? Not just knowledge of intentions and goals. So what we see and what we value in nature is partially informed by our understanding of its ecology and its history. In fact, with this kind of knowledge, a seemingly barren and uninteresting landscape can be rendered very unique and complex and compelling. An ecologist who spent his life studying a particular area will see more in it, and hence will see more to value in it than an ecologically illiterate tourist. So the analogy between restored landscapes and forgeries holds, because in each case what we do is our value judgments are influenced by our knowledge of the forgery and of the landscape. It's slightly different knowledge in each case, but the point is that values are informed by knowledge. And I think that's probably true. The more you know about a landscape, or the more you know about an artist, the more you may be able to see to value, the more you may be able to see in the landscape or in the painting or whatever. Okay, so those were some objections that Eliot discussed in his paper. I'll now think about two objections that Eliot doesn't raise, but that I think are worth considering. So 5. Notice that the argument has to be about restored areas that are largely identical to the original areas. Now, Eliot doesn't state his argument in this way, but I think that this was maybe a bit of an oversight. Eliot does actually note in his paper, so he himself notes, that a landscape can have many other sources of value beyond naturalness. Here are just some that Eliot notes. He says diversity of animal and plant life, stability of complex ecosystems, tall trees. So those are things that we value beyond naturalness in the sense of unmodified by human activity. So if we were to perform a mining operation on some very barren part of the land, say Dungeness, then afterwards we restore it by not just rebuilding Dungeness, but actually producing a very lush forest, well, the restored area would be more valuable than the original. Even though it doesn't have the naturalness, it's got various other kinds of value, because it has this complex ecosystem and tall trees and so on. Actually, I personally really like Dungeness. I've never been there, but if you look at pictures of it, it's I think a very striking place. I'm not sure that it would be improved by giving it a forest, but based on what Eliot takes to be valuable, it seems that if we were to mine Dungeness and then build a forest on it, that would make it even better. So, I mean, the problem for Eliot's argument is that restoration never produces an identical area. And this makes it very unclear what Eliot's argument actually achieves. So most of the time, obviously, a restored area is going to be worse than the original. But this just brings us back to the standard pragmatic argument against restoration proposals. So, contrary to the promises of the company, the area won't really be restored. Well, in that case, Elliot's argument, Elliot's appeal to naturalness, is just superfluous. On the other hand, if the company can persuade us that they will restore the area properly, and so if the company can sort of dislodge this standard pragmatic argument, it shouldn't be too difficult also to persuade us that they'll add various other sources of value to compensate for the naturalness that's lost. So if we can restore Dungeness, if we can restore it to its current condition, we can surely improve its ecological value. Just add better soils, plant more trees than were originally there, and so on. The point is that even if we grant Elliot's conclusion, even if there is some kind of value that will necessarily be lost in a restored environment, it's not really clear that this actually has any force against proposed restoration projects. Elliot clearly intends his argument to be a contribution to the environmental movement. It's not just abstract academic daydreaming. But if that's his goal, I think he possibly misses his mark. It's not really clear to me what possible role his argument could have in a debate between environmentalists and a company proposing some environmentally damaging project. It's not really clear, I think, where this appeal to naturalness, what work Elliot's argument can actually do. Okay, so 6. The second claim in Elliot's argument, that restored areas are analogous in relevant respects to forged artworks, is very questionable. So are restored areas analogous to forgeries in a way that's relevant to our evaluation of them? Well, one way to approach this question is to ask why exactly we consider forgeries to be aesthetically deficient. Now, an intuitive and very popular response is that forgeries are aesthetically deficient because they lack originality. Originality does seem to be something that we value in the arts. Many artworks are famous for pretty much nothing other than having innovative original features. And evidently enough, a forgery won't be remotely original, at least in terms of its intrinsic properties. Indeed, the more effective a forgery is at fooling people, the less original it will be. So forgeries are aesthetically deficient because they lack originality. But this kind of explanation just doesn't work for restoration projects. Nobody wants the restored area to look original. Ideally, it should be indistinguishable from its former state. So there is just this major disanalogy between forged artworks and restored areas. Now, I think there are some big problems with appealing to originality to explain the aesthetic deficiency of forgeries. I won't go into those problems here. That would take us too far afield. I'll do another video about it sometime, maybe. But obviously, I think that Elliot can resist this objection. There is, however, a second difference between environmental restoration and art forgery, pointed out by Richard Sylvan, that I think is rather more damaging to Elliot's second premise, which is that while art forgery necessarily involves deception, there's no deception involved in restoration proposals, at least not in principle. No doubt many restoration proposals are deceptive in that they suggest that more effort and more care will be expended on the restoration than anybody in fact intends to offer. But whereas a fake or a forgery necessarily involves passing off a copy as an original, restoration needn't necessarily involve pretending that the restored environment has been untouched. So restored environments are nothing like forgeries. They're more analogous to mere copies of artworks. So the question is, would an exact copy of an artwork be less aesthetically valuable than the original artwork? Well, to me, the answer is obvious. It depends. Most of the time, an exact copy would be of equal value. In certain special cases, the copy would be of less value, for instance, where the original has some special historical significance. It was painted by a famous person or whatever. In other cases, the copy would be of more valuable. For instance, if the copy has been produced in some special way. Consider a not especially remarkable painting copied exactly by a robot. Well, we might value the copy more than the original because of the special history of the copy. It's the first painting that's been made by a robot, or at least I guess actually there are probably lots of copies of things being made by robots now. But imagine like a humanoid robot, a proper sort of humanoid android, and it paints its first painting by copying it. We might value that one just because of its special history. Now, Elliot might respond to this, that this is exactly what he's been arguing, right? He's been arguing that the history of an object makes a difference to its value. A natural landscape can be valuable precisely because of its naturalness, because of its history of developing without human interference. And I accept that point. But then the question is, what exactly is the purpose of this analogy to forgeries? We can make exactly the same point, just more accurately, by drawing an analogy between restored landscapes and mere copies. Indeed, Elliot himself draws this analogy in his example of being promised a Vermeer painting for his birthday present. In the example as Elliot gives it, the receiver of the gift is explicitly told that the painting is not an original Vermeer, so there's no deception involved. The appeal to forgeries looks at best superfluous and at worst misleading. The point, of course, is that with a forgery there's a sort of, I think, negativity implied in the very word forgery. We certainly tend to feel negatively about forgeries. So by implying that restored landscapes are analogous to forgeries, he's sort of carrying over that negativity into restored landscapes. Now, if the appropriate analogy is simply that restored landscapes are merely like copies, then there is no implied negativity. And of course, as we pointed out, as we saw, there's absolutely no reason why a restored landscape would have to be worse than the original. If the landscape is restored and then more items of value are added, that might be a lot better than the original. So, to conclude then, I do think there is something attractive about Eliot's conclusion, that a restored landscape that's identical to the original could be less valuable than the original. I think Eliot is right that the history of an item is relevant to our evaluation of it. But I think there are still some big problems with his argument, and it's certainly questionable whether it really has much force against restoration proposals. So, that's something to think about then. I'm not sure I really am totally persuaded by Elliot, but there you go. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.